For the next hour or so, share with us some interesting glimpses into the history of the Furnas family, your family. While we'll use the Furnas name almost exclusively in this work, we're quick to admit that we're taking a somewhat narrow view of history. After all, every time a Furnas male married, his offspring, or issue as they used to be called, were half something else. The Furnas family is certainly not made up entirely of the sons of the sons of the sons who carry the name forward. There are, of course, Furnas daughters and their daughters, and just as important are the Furnases by marriage or by adoption, so many of whom have made great contributions to our heritage. And we point with pride to the fact that quite often it's these special Furnases who are the active genealogists of the family, browsing the libraries, writing the letters of inquiry, maintaining the records, and providing the common bond that holds us all together. Whether we like it or not, genealogy is based on one of the few constants in Western societies, that being the family surname. Those who are in the forefront in the documentation of our family's genealogy are people such as Jane Furnas of Arizona, Helen Furnas Brown of Ohio, Rosetta Furnas of Arkansas, Marilyn Schlutz of Iowa, Sparkle Moore Furnas of Colorado, the McGriffins and the Millers from Indiana and Colorado. And we realize that in naming a few, we overlook the many. And for this, we apologize, because there are many Furnases across the country who are equally steeped in our family's history. We wish to thank not just those who provided us with data and information on the family, but those who contributed financial assistance for putting together this story, from the smallest gift to the largest. We hope you enjoy the results.
Hello, I'm Randy Furnas. Like many of you, I'm an eighth-generation Furnas to be born here in America. From John and Mary, to Joseph, to John, Joseph Evans, Oliver Perry, Glenn, and William. With that, let's find out now where we've been and how we got to where we are. Keep in mind, this is not intended to be a genealogical study of who begot whom. It's our family's history in story form. So cousins, sit back and enjoy. The vast majority of the Furnases in America have their roots firmly planted in England, specifically here in the rich soil of northern England. Known as the Lake District, it is an area of warm-hearted people where you find rustic towns such as Carlisle with its Tudor architecture, and where you can still walk beneath the arches of Hadrian's Wall, built by the Roman legions nearly 2,000 years ago. The Lake District is a landscape of marvelous rolling hills, castles, the ruins of a once magnificent abbey, a number of scenic lakes, brooks, and rivers, mountains, winding roads, modest farms, and flocks of strangely marked sheep grazing in fields separated from one another by picturesque stone fences. Furnace, as most of us spell it today, is F-U-R-N-A-S. It could just as easily end with ESS, ISS, ACE, or even, yes, ASS. Let your mind go back more than 1,000 years. In the early 800s, Danish raiders attacked and had their way with England until they were finally defeated, around the year 890 by King Alfred the Great. But there are many cultural remnants of their presence still existing in the country, some of which may well apply to the Furnas name. Let's begin with the fact that there is a Furnas Peninsula in northern England, Furnas with an ESS, and there is a town on that peninsula called Barrow-in-Furness. We're pretty sure that's how the name was originally spelled. Keeping in mind that the Danes dominated things centuries ago, the true origin of the name seems to be this. Ness is a Danish word for a jut of land sticking out into the water. If you stand on the English mainland, about here, and look out across a portion of Morecambe Bay, you would see a town, Barrow, on a jut of land. 1,000 years ago, a Dane might well have thought of that as a far ness, a distant bit of land sticking out into the water. Farness, Furnas, thus the name Furnas. The town visible from the mainland was Barrow, thus the name Barrow-in-Furness. It was fairly common back then for people to take the name of their town or county or even an entire area as their family name. So it's not much of a stretch to imagine Farness becoming Furnas, and people from Furnas might well have decided on that as their family's name. To help us better understand our family's history, we should have at least a general idea of what was going on in England in those early years. Let's begin with the words Anglo and Saxon. What does Anglo-Saxon mean? Well, the Angles and the Saxons were tribes that began leaving Germany around 400 AD, crossing the Channel and invading England. The Saxons settled in the southern and western sections of the country. Almost simultaneously, the Angles advanced to the Welsh border, and within 200 years they controlled much of northwestern England, as far as Cumbria in the Lake District, and up into southwest Scotland. Well, since we know that our ancestors emigrated from England's Lake District, we can be pretty sure that we Furnases are Anglo-Saxons and are probably more Anglo than Saxon. As an aside, the abbey we mentioned a few moments ago is known as Furnas Abbey. It is located near Barrow-in-Furness. Begun in the year 1127 by Stephen, who later became King of England, Furnas Abbey took 300 years to complete. In medieval times, Furnas Abbey was one of Britain's great religious houses. In fact, it was one of the richest abbeys in the entire kingdom, and it was recognized by the crown with this impressive crest, or coat of arms. Today, its ruins are still visited by thousands of people each year and is considered a national treasure by the British government. There are those who fondly but mistakenly think of the abbey as the Furnas homestead. But as you can see, just from the remains of the apse, the nave, and so on, that this once proud house of worship was never intended to be anything but an abbey. Nor was it ever connected with what we consider to be the Furnas family. But let's get back to our name. Even though we may all accept the notion that the original spelling ended with ESS, we can't help but wonder how it became NAS. This range of spellings was no doubt the result of church officials, scriveners, and tax collectors who lacked writing and spelling skills, so they just jotted down the name as best they could, phonetically. Moving on, once the Anglos and Saxons stopped squabbling, England enjoyed a relative calm until the Norman conquest in 1066. This time, it was the French who invaded Britain and gained control over huge sections of the country. But within a few years, peace broke out once again, and soon after, the name Furnas emerged as a notable English family with considerable land holdings. Again, Furnas with an ESS ending. But now, as they say, the plot thickens. In the years from about 1500 to 1800, England was racked by internal religious conflicts. It was the time of the Puritan Revolution, first Protestantism, then the radical followers of Oliver Cromwell, and then the remnants of the Catholic Church, which was rejecting everyone except their own members. Each doctrine fighting for supremacy, and none of them was hesitant about inflicting cruel and terrible treatment on their perceived enemies. It seems to have become a national paranoia, because unless a person was actually inside a church, it was illegal for him or her to preach any religion. Well, about 1650, a man with his own vision of what Christianity should be roamed the fields and back roads of northern England. His name was George Fox. George Fox was the founder of the Quaker religion. Much of George Fox's time was spent in the Lake District, where he preached his monotheistic, meaning one God, doctrine. A person of very limited means, he frequently stayed for brief periods with friends and converts. One such stopping place was at the home of a Judge Thomas Farrell, here in the town of Ulverston, near Barrow. Judge Farrell and his wife, Margaret, were Puritans and were very much opposed to the large, established churches of the time. Today, the historian at the home of Judge Farrell, now called Swarthmore Hall, tells of Fox coming there while His Honor was in London on a business trip. Margaret had listened to George Fox before and was convinced that he spoke the truth. The judge was skeptical, as were his neighbors. Obviously, an early version of Here Comes the Judge, we're told that his neighbors were waiting for him when he returned from his trip.
They said, "You must hurry home at once. Your wife and your family and your whole household has been bewitched by a traveling man." So poor Judge Farrell was worried, because witchcraft was a very serious business in those days.
When he arrived at home, the house was very quiet, and the judge was convinced something strange had happened. But Margaret and the family were perfectly safe, and Margaret was anxious to discuss George Fox with her husband. Even then, the way to a man's heart was through his stomach.
She gave him his meal and said, "Will you hear what George Fox has to say?" And the judge was a remarkably tolerant man for the time. He said, "Bring him to my parlor, and I will hear him." Well, he was a forcible speaker. He had a very, very deep, sound voice. After hearing what George Fox was saying, he offered his home. Until then, they had no place. They had no safe haven.
For 6 years, until the judge died, Fox and his followers held their meetings at the judge's home. But with the death of this powerful friend, the persecutions returned. Incidentally, beautiful Swarthmore Hall is still open to the public, and George Fox's large trunk, clearly marked with his initials and 1675, is still on display there. It was because of his admonition to his flock to quake at the word of the Lord that his followers were widely referred to as Quakers, although they chose to call themselves Children of the Light. This name was later changed to the Society of Friends, with members referring to one another merely as friends, as they do today. Followers of Quakerism were badgered and often imprisoned for their beliefs, but it was within this flock that many of the early Furnases found the kind of religion which they loved and followed. About now, you may well be asking why we have included so much Quaker history in the story of the Furnases. After all, the number of Furnases still practicing Quakerism is undoubtedly far smaller than it was back then. Well, our reasoning is very simple. The early Furnases were very dedicated to their religion. It played an important role in their lives and their community. To give Quakerism any less attention would be to overlook a vital element in the makeup of our ancestors and leave a gaping tear in the family's fabric. Quite a few Furnases feel that this is a reproduction of an authentic Furnas family coat of arms. Well, it is, but it is not an ancient one. It is a Fur NESS coat of arms that was awarded in the 20th century. According to the authority on such matters, Sir Bernard Burke's book, Peerage, Baronetage, and Knightage, this is the coat of arms of the second Viscount Furnas, who received the honor in 1962. This, too, is a Furnas coat of arms. Again, ESS. It belongs to Sir Christopher Furnas, 2nd Knight of Tunstall Grange. Sir Christopher served the British Royal Navy during World War II from 1940 to 1945. The book shows no awarding of such family crests to a Furnas, F-U-R-N-A-S. The conclusion, the only Furnases we can find any record of having been awarded this honor received them about 50 years ago. However, we do know that there was a Lady Furnas, ESS, who served in the British Parliament in the mid to early part of the 20th century. So at this stage, we are not able to connect our spelling of the family name with any historic coat of arms or crest. We're still open to new information. So let's get to some specifics about our branch of the Furnas family. It was here at a place called Wigton, just a few miles from the southern border of Scotland, at Standing Stone, that Thomas Furnas lived with his wife Rebecca and their 7 children. According to records, Thomas was a landholder near here and a person of some stature. Their offspring were Mary, Robert, Joseph, John, twin sons Thomas and Jonathan, and the youngest child, Sarah. It was from this place that our branch of the great Furnas adventure to the New World began over 230 years ago. So let's begin our account of the Furnas family with the generation that departed from England and settled in America. John was 26 at the time he took Mary Wilkinson as his bride. Mary was 20. Soon after they were wed, they, along with John's twin brothers, emigrated to America, arriving here in Charlestown, South Carolina, in February of 1763. These are engravings made around 1762. This one is entitled An Exact Prospect of Charlestown, the metropolis of the province of South Carolina. Note that the bustling maritime city was called Charlestown. It would not become Charleston for another 20 years. But this was the first view our travelers had of the New World in the 1760s. And surprisingly, much of Charleston today reflects the culture and architecture that prevailed centuries ago. For instance, on this spot in downtown Charleston, there is about a 5-foot by perhaps 60-foot section along a sidewalk, which is all that remains of old Quaker monthly meetings and cemetery. Read for yourself what it says on the plaque. The Great Turk refers to a pilgrimage to Sultan Mohammed IV made by Quaker Mary Fisher in 1658 to convert the followers of Islam to Christianity. And there she spake to the Great Turk. And at this time we hasten to emphasize the obvious, that the Quaker movement was not dominated entirely by men. On the contrary, women have historically played vital roles in Quakerism. Elizabeth Gurney Fry is another example. An English Quaker, born in 1780, she was horrified at the hopelessness of life in London prisons, particularly among women. Many of these women had their children with them in these filthy prisons. Fry became the voice of the English conscience, visiting prisons, finding work for ex-convicts when they were released, and starting schools for their children. Because of her work, countless humanitarian changes were made in the English and our own penal systems. So next time you feel the need to do something for mankind, all we can suggest is, it's your Quaker blood boiling. Now, back to the story of the Furnases. The simplest and perhaps the most widely accepted story of John and Mary coming to the New World is that as young folks, they met, fell in love, married, moved to America, settled at Bush River, their offspring came to Ohio, and from there the family spread to virtually all parts of the country. Other than that, just fill in the blanks. Well, pull up a chair. There's a lot more to the story than that. The probability is that when John and Mary came to America in 1763, John had been here before. Something not generally realized by many of us today is the fact that in the 1750s, Nearly 15 years before John and Mary landed in Charlestown, small groups of Irish Quakers were arriving from Dublin. That's right, Dublin, as in Dublin, Ireland. That's what this line on the map shows. About now, you're probably saying, first Quaker history, now Irish history? What's all this got to do with the Furnases? Well, on one voyage in particular, the intent was for the shipload of Irish Quakers to land in North Carolina, but the captain, who lacked navigational skills, landed them instead here at Charlestown in South Carolina. At that point, these pioneers made a momentous decision. Rather than suffer the long and tortuous overland trek to North Carolina, they chose to remain in South Carolina and eventually settled here in the area of the Wateree Monthly Meeting near the town of Camden. And it was here that these Quaker families, already steeped in their natural work ethic, lived up to their heritage as hard-working, honest family folks. They plied their trades and built a community of cooperation where families were free and contented. Fact is, one of the arrivals from Ireland was a Samuel Kelly. Another was a cabinet maker named Robert Millhouse. Records show that Millhouse brought with him from Ireland a young apprentice. The young man is described in a book of the South Carolina Historical Society. In the chapter entitled The Irish Quaker Community at Camden, the youngster was John Furnas, a 16-year-old son of an English Quaker, from the same place our John lived. Compare the facts. 16 years old, same age our John Furnas would have been, son of an English Quaker, same as our John Furnas. Could there have been two John Furnases, both Quakers, both the same age, both from the same area of England? Not likely. No, it is far more probable that they were one and the same person. No one argues whether or not John married Mary Wilkinson, but with the information from the records of the Irish Quakers, we now feel that for whatever reason, he went first to Ireland, where he joined the Edenderry Monthly Meeting. There, he met both Millhouse and Samuel Kelly. As mentioned before, while he was in Ireland, he worked as an apprentice to Millhouse, then came with Millhouse and Kelly to America, where all three joined the Quaker group at Camden. Something to bear in mind, around this same time here in America, the French and Indian War was raging, and people were fleeing the war zone to avoid it. Many left Wateree and moved westward. There they resettled in Newberry County, where, a few years later, Bush River Monthly Meeting was established. Minutes from one of these later Bush River Monthly Meetings show the presence of a Furnas and a Kelly, both of whom are referred to as former Wateree families. We must assume, then, that Kelly and Furnas migrated from Camden to Newberry. There they could continue their friendship, and John could decide whether or not this was where he could live happily and raise his family. And only after making that decision did John return to England, tell Mary Wilkinson of his marvelous experience in the New World, marry her, and in less than a year bring her back to Charlestown. Now let's take a breather and talk a bit about John Furnas, the man. Here are two stories, or perhaps two versions of the same story, neither of which can be proved or disproved. We leave the acceptance or rejection of these up to you. Oliver Perry Furnas, who was born in 1855 and was the great-great-grandson of John and Mary Furnas, was a noted clergyman from Miami County, Ohio. Mr. Furnas was, like so many people with Quaker backgrounds, an inveterate writer and note-taker. This is the Bible, which the Reverend Mr. Furnas used for many years, and in it are endless notations, mostly about whom begot whom. But on the backs of so many of the illustrated pages are fascinating references to other things about the family. But perhaps the Furnas family's most cherished historical fact is that Mary was with child during the long and treacherous voyage from Britain to America. And upon their arrival in Charlestown, she gave birth to Joseph while they were still aboard the ship in the harbor. The date of his birth, February 20th, 1763. This final line represents the trek of the young family from Charlestown to Newberry County. But until we learned that John had most likely been here before, we had to wonder why the couple left Charlestown so soon after their arrival to make that agonizing 100-mile trip to Newberry. The baby was just a few months old at most, and the mother was slowly recovering from the ordeal of the ocean voyage plus the pains of childbirth. The only plausible answer is what we said about his being here before, that John knew precisely where he wanted to take them and was anxious for them to begin their lives together near Newberry and the tiny Bush River. Add to this the fact that Charlestown was a very big city, and the people who lived there, by and large, were British citizens. And remember, it was the British citizens who were persecuting Quakers in England because Quakerism did not fit the English concept of Christianity. So most likely, when the Quakers came to the colonies and landed in cities like Charlestown, they were greeted with open hostility rather than open arms. Fine and dandy, but why did so many Quakers move to Ohio just 40 years after struggling for so long getting to and settling in South Carolina? Well, to begin with, think what South Carolina was in 1763 and what it wasn't. It wasn't a state because the United States did not yet exist. The American Revolution was still a dozen years away. South Carolina was a British colony, a province. This copy of the original land grant, dated August 27, 1764, seems to suggest, though, that John did maintain some ties with the mother country. It states that
George III, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, and so forth, greeting. Know ye that we of our special grace, certain knowledge and mere motion, do give and grant unto John Furnas, his heirs and assigns, a plantation or tract of land containing 100 acres, surveyed the 29th of June, 1763.
this is a map of South Carolina, and this is the Newberry District. In that Newberry District, you see a small triangular area. This is a close-up of that triangular area called Brown's Crossroads, Land Grant, Map 6, dated 1764. It shows the exact location of the piece of land owned by John Furnas, land which is located just a few miles from the city of Newberry. And it notes that from 1763 to 1764, John's holdings had grown from 100 to 150 acres. Not bad for a country lad from Wigton. As for Bush River, it was almost a utopia for the new arrivals. Folks who lived there were happy and the community grew rapidly. In fact, by the 1780s, there were nearly 150 families living there. And it was there that the family of John and Mary Furnas became active in their community. John and his friend Samuel Kelly went into partnership with the Kelly and Furnas General Store, and the family of John and Mary grew steadily. Joseph, of course, was born in Charlestown Harbor, but at Bush River, 6 other children were born to them. Joseph, Rebecca, John, Thomas Wilkinson, Esther, Robert, and finally, William. 3 or 4 miles from the town of Newberry, South Carolina, by the side of a little-traveled road, you come across an old country graveyard. It is called Bush River Cemetery, and although it has a handsome plaque, the grounds have become terribly overrun by all sorts of trees and vines. The plaque reads, Bush River Quaker Meeting. This old cemetery marks the site of the Bush River Meeting House, settled by Quakers in the 1760s. It was a monthly meeting, 1770 to 1822, and a quarterly meeting with jurisdiction over all meetings in South Carolina and Georgia from 1791 to 1808. Opposing slavery, the members moved west and settled Quaker meetings in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. By 1782, both John and Mary had died and are most likely buried here in unmarked graves. The Kellys are here, and the Pearsons, but no readable Furnas names are here on any of the headstones. Perhaps this is because, although gravestones were sometimes erected in the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Yearly Meeting of England in 1717 noted that the custom was vain, and it asked that such stones be removed and no others should be set up. Even so, you can still glimpse the beauty of the area and imagine what it must have been like more than 2 centuries ago. Yes, there really was and is a Bush River. This is it today, and it probably looks about as it did 2 centuries ago. Just a small, unimposing stream, but at one time providing water to the tiny Quaker community. Walking among the simple markers of the cemetery, and along the banks of the little Bush River today, one can almost hear and feel the sounds of families at work, at play, at meditation and prayer. All 7 of the children of John and Mary Furnas, as well as their children, emigrated to Ohio between 1803 and 1806. Why? Probably for several reasons. Among them, the ugly institution of slavery. It is generally acknowledged that there were some slave-holding Quakers at this time, but these folks were extremely uncomfortable about it. Some claimed there were no slaves held at Bush River, but records tell of none other than Samuel Kelly, John Furnas's business partner, refusing to give up those he owned. In fact, he put it in his will that when he died, his slaves would pass on only to members of his family. By and large, however, toward the end of the 1790s, Quakers came to believe very strongly that slavery was a curse, and slowly awoke to its evil. But there was a catch-22 even back then. Morally, they couldn't keep slaves. Legally, they couldn't free them. Seeing no other way out of their dilemma, most Quakers transferred title of their slaves to the yearly meeting. The family would surrender title to the slaves, sell their property for perhaps half its real worth, and move away. The first sign of Bush River's demise came in 1787. That was the year Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was a new law which mandated that, for the first time ever, a government had made land free of slavery. Then the question arose, what lands? As it turned out, it was all of the land north and west of the Ohio River. This land was called the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance had teeth in it because it was a federal law, and it forever prohibited slaves from being held in that land, no matter who settled there and regardless of what kind of local government would eventually be set up there. This opened the door to the immigration of no doubt thousands of people, like the Furnases, who wished to avoid the slavery issue. The next indication of Bush River's problems came in the mid-1790s. Daniel Boone discovered a passage through the Appalachian Mountains. With help from Cherokee Indians, he established a passable road through the wilderness. It was aptly named the Wilderness Road. Boone began sending out glowing reports of this marvelous place where there was abundant wildlife, beautiful land that could be cultivated, and friendly Indians. Not just a promised land, but a promised land free of slavery. Then a third event took place, which seems to have contributed mightily to the fate of the Bush River settlement. You'll recall that the first was the ugly issue of slavery. The second the discovery of the pass through the Appalachian Mountains by way of the Cumberland Gap. And the third reason for their leaving South Carolina was perhaps the most telling. It was a man named Zachary Dix. Zachary Dix was a prominent Quaker who was believed to have the gift of prophecy, that he was spoken to by God, and that he was told of things that would take place. He often spoke to gatherings and to a disturbing degree correctly predicted many upcoming events. In his travels, Dix visited various meetings, including Bush River. He spoke frighteningly of hell's fire and brimstone, damning the institution of slavery, stating that the Friends would soon leave the South and that they would abandon Bush River. He said, too, that the grounds would become grown over with vines and weeds. Sounds a bit like the cemetery as it is today, doesn't it? Zachary Dix's vision of the future was so vivid that people of Bush River panicked, once again making his dire predictions self-fulfilling. Only 3 years after he spoke at Bush River, the quarterly meeting recommended that the few remaining residents sell the meeting house and the property. There were just not enough people left there to maintain it. As for the trip through the wilderness of the Appalachians, these woods and thickets near Bush River typify what the families had to cut through for 500 to 600 miles to reach Ohio from South Carolina. But these sturdy pioneer families hacked their way through the thickets, felling trees and taking with them not just their children and their elders, but virtually everything they owned. The agonizing trip took them across the broad river in western North Carolina, over the Appalachians, and through the awesome Cumberland Pass, across eastern Tennessee and Kentucky. Then it was time to cross the mighty Ohio River. Their goal was to reach Warren County, another day's travel north of the river. Consider the tortuous trip of several months' duration. One must stand in awe of the courage and stamina shown by these brave people. Some were fortunate enough to own good 4- and 5-horse teams and wagons, assuring them of what was considered first-class passage. In Eli J's booklet entitled The Furnas Family in America, he told of a family that came in an old 1-horse wagon.
The poor animal was too weak to allow all to ride at one time, and Cousin Eli was told that the oldest child, a boy of 12, walked more than 600 miles to Ohio. Some families without vehicles came on horseback, with all their worldly goods tied on its back. Another family, which Eli J. had heard of, not having means for the whole journey, stopped in Kentucky and raised a crop to shore up their finances.
In 1801, John Hoover, a distant cousin to the Furnas family, and coincidentally a forefather to Herbert Hoover, fled his home in North Carolina, and they too came to southern Ohio, settling perhaps 50 miles farther north of Waynesville, near Dayton. In a letter written by Hoover's grandson, it says,
"They came to the dense and lofty forests on the Stillwater River, where they lived in their wagon. The box-the bed being the shape of a boat, were called North Carolina schooners. They soon built small cabins out of the green logs, covered them with brush and leaves, leaving one side open near which they kept a fire burning day and night to protect them from the wolves, panthers, bears, and other ravenous wild beasts."
The first Furnas to come to Ohio from South Carolina was Robert, who arrived here in 1802. In much the same manner as his father before him had come to America, Robert came north to more or less survey the land and weigh its opportunities. He then returned to South Carolina, gathered together many of the other Furnas family members, and returned with them to Ohio in 1803, the very year Ohio officially became a state. When they left South Carolina, all 7 of the children of the original John and Mary Furnas of Standing Stone, England, settled first near Caesars Creek in Warren County, but only 2 of them made that their permanent homes. They were Robert Furnas and his brother John. Within a few years, the other Furnas families pushed farther north into Montgomery and Miami counties, the same area John Hoover chose a few years earlier. According to the Quaker Book of Discipline of the Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting, the migration to the Waynesville, Ohio area began in 1790. By April of 1801, 12 families, 81 individuals, in the Waynesville area began meeting for worship in a member's home. Later that year, they requested and obtained permission to establish a regular meeting, one which was to be called Miami. Building of this handsome white brick meeting house at Waynesville was begun in 1811 to accommodate the quarterly meeting. By 1815, the Miami monthly meeting was not just the first monthly meeting in all of the Northwest Territory, but is said to have had the largest membership of any Friends meeting in all of Quakerdom. The Miami monthly meeting is still a beautiful structure and remains an active building where Quaker worship is still held there each Sunday. Let's take a moment and re-examine each of the 7 offspring a bit closer. Their firstborn, Joseph, married Sarah Pearson, and despite the fact that he was the oldest, Joseph was the last of the 7 children to leave Bush River and head to the Northwest Territory. Rebecca was next. A few months after her mother's death, Rebecca, at age 19, married Samuel Teague, a non-Quaker. Rebecca bore Samuel Teague 11 children, all of whom were born in South Carolina. John was the third offspring. He married twice. His first wife was Esther Wilson. 3 years after Esther's death, John married Ruth Cook. He and Ruth came to Ohio in 1804, and it was their descendants who first left Ohio and settled in Indiana. Thomas Wilkinson Furnas was the 4th child of John and Mary. Thomas married Rachel Coate outside the Friends meeting. They settled in Miami County, where he became a highly respected member of the Ohio General Assembly. Next in line was daughter Esther. Esther married Benjamin Pearson at the age of 20 and raised 10 children. Of the 21 children born to the 2 Furnas sisters, 18 grew to adulthood. Esther and Benjamin Pearson came to Ohio in 1805 and settled in Miami County. Robert was the 6th offspring. He married Hannah Wilson in 1796, then, as previously mentioned, became the first Furnas to reach Ohio from Bush River. And finally, we come to child number 7, William. William married Rachel Nesby while in South Carolina and settled in Newton Township in Miami County. 7 fine children, all born in South Carolina, all left there and settled near the town of Waynesville in southern Ohio. Perhaps this is the time to mention an event which took place in the mid to late 1960s. Here, in an area just 3 or 4 miles east of Waynesville, there was a beautiful valley with a couple of country roads and a pretty little creek running through it. The stream was called Caesar's Creek. Because of the growing popularity of man-made lakes, the low ground around the creek was being cleared of trees and dead timber by the U.S. Corps of Engineers. In the area to be flooded was a crossroad, graced by perhaps 10 dilapidated and apparently abandoned shacks with warped and faded clapboard siding. Obviously, if a lake was to be built here, these old buildings had to be removed. Otherwise, when the project was finished and the area flooded, the remnants of these old shacks would float to the surface and present boaters and vacationers with dangerous debris. We are told that, as a bulldozer operator began to level one of the shacks, he noticed logs beneath the weathered siding. He was perceptive enough to realize that there was something of possible historic value here, so he stopped and reported his strange find to his supervisors. Made aware of the existence of log cabins, authorities evaluated the situation and decided that the structures were indeed worth preserving. So they were all carefully dismantled, one log at a time, and the pieces cataloged. The federal government then granted sizable acreage of beautifully treed high ground above the new lake. There, the century-old cabins were reassembled, and that is where they stand today, in what is called Caesars Creek Pioneer Village. One of these was an early cabin of Seth Furnas. Seth was the son of Robert, who arrived in Ohio in 1802. The cabin was built around 1850, and today it, along with a tiny plot of ground behind it, is called the working farm of the Pioneer Village. In retrospect, the Furnas family in America is truly a series of odysseys. You'll recall that the first was John's initial venture from Ireland to America, where he became friends with the Kellys and determined that he would bring his family to Bush River. The second odyssey was a few years later, John's return to England. The third odyssey was the terrifying trip of John, Mary, Jonathan, and Thomas across the Atlantic, a terrible journey of thousands of miles lasting weeks and weeks. The fourth odyssey was the slow and tortuous 600-mile overland trip to Ohio through the Appalachian Mountains. And now, starting in Ohio, we introduce Odyssey number 5, the fanning out of the Furnas families across the country. By 1820, Furnases were in Indiana. The decade of the 1840s found Furnases in Kansas. New York by the 1850s, along with Pennsylvania, Missouri, Colorado, Texas, and Iowa, as well as Illinois and Nebraska. By the 1860s, Minnesota, and Nevada in the 70s. From Nevada, Furnaces headed not only south and west, but northwest as well. By the 1880s, our cousins were in Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. Today, we know of Furnaces in all of those states, plus others in Rhode Island, Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Tennessee, Maine, Idaho, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Michigan, Kentucky, Oklahoma, New Mexico, New Jersey, Alabama, Vermont, Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Virginia. 37 states in all, and the number continues to grow. Now add your cousins in 2 provinces of Canada and another Furnas family down under in Australia, so it is probably pretty safe to assume that there are now Furnases in virtually all of the contiguous 48 states, and there's a good chance they're in Alaska and Hawaii as well. With that international flavor in mind, we report that several cousins have mentioned the following. 800 miles due west of Portugal in the North Atlantic lie the Azores, a series of small islands about halfway between Europe and America. Historians are not sure who first sighted these islands, but Portuguese navigators in 1431 were the first to confirm their existence. Here, on São Miguel, the largest of these islands, is the tiny town of Furnas, F-U-R-N-A-S, a crater-cupped resort that attracts American and European visitors who hope the spa's steaming mineral waters hold healing power. Nearby is Lake Furnas, which was created by the eruption of Furnas volcano some 12,000 years ago. Cozito is a popular dish around Furnas in the Azores. Folks simply wrap various meats and vegetables together in a cloth and bury it in a hole in the ground near Lake Furnas. Here, the surrounding soil reaches more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit. There, the concoction is allowed to steam naturally for 9 or 10 hours, and voila, Furnas kebabs. But which Furnas, or Furnases, these geographic wonders were named for, we just don't know. Virtually hundreds of Furnases are now aware of the numerous appearances of the name Furnas in southwestern Ohio. South of Dayton, at Waynesville in Warren County, north of Dayton, in Miami and Montgomery counties. In those counties north of Dayton, we find Furnas Road, the John Furnas Homestead, and Furnas Cemetery on Furnas Road. County authorities have begun to maintain this little plot where many of our ancestors are buried. Joseph Evans Furnas, his wife Sally, and many others. Indiana, too, is well represented by Furnases in an exceptional cross-section of professions and positions of prominence. Of equal importance to the family are the historical landmarks in and around Brownville, Nebraska. It was from this community that Robert Furnas, Nebraska's second governor, came. And there are other Furnasian signposts in far-flung areas of the world. One Furnas reports seeing a Furnas road as she taxied south of Rio de Janeiro. Another Furnas says that Furnas, as a proper name, also crops up in Greece. Today, we know of Furnases residing in Queensland, Australia. Others have settled in Canada. Oddly enough, we have no record of any Furnases in England, our mother country. Today, no Furnases are listed on the records of either Wigton or Standing Stone. Furnases who helped establish the unique credentials of the Furnas family in America include religious, industrial, and professional leaders. As we said, Indiana is well represented, as are Ohio, Illinois, California, Nebraska, Arkansas, Arizona, and so on. But let's pause for a moment and give a tip of the hat to one or two companies that bear, or at one time bore, the family name. Many of us have heard about Furnas Ice Cream Company, which existed many decades ago in the Midwest. It was in the 1930s that the company offered this little palate pleaser. It was called the Furnas Mellow Roll. The customer would buy the cylindrical paper-wrapped ice cream of whatever the desired flavor. The ice cream and the cone came to about a nickel. This, of course, is just a paper mock-up, but with the real thing, the paper wrapper would be peeled off and the ice cream deposited in the cone by the customer. A fine labor saver for the store. A little messy for the customers, but great to eat. It's believed that the Furnas Ice Cream Company was started in Indiana, and supporting that belief is this. These are photos of an extremely rare Seth Thomas advertising clock from around 1885. The clock had different advertisements on paper rolls and operated in the same way a player piano worked. An advertising change would take place every 30 seconds. This is the back side of the clock, which happens to have an ad for Furnas ice cream. Here, the well-to-do lady is telling her servant, Samuel, go to Furnas's, 54 Massachusetts Avenue, and get 3 quarts of ice cream. Don't stop somewhere closer and get some that ain't good. What's that? A Quaker descendant with a black servant? Beneath the 2, we can still read, Indianapolis, Indiana. The clock was seen at a flea market about 1980 and was priced between $8,000 and $9,000. To the best of our knowledge, Furnas Ice Cream Company was subsequently bought out by Borden's, and the memorabilia that still remain in flea markets and antique stores is rare and expensive. Furnas Electric Company is a true Horatio Alger story of success. From the humblest beginnings in the basement of its founder, Furnas Electric today is perhaps the 4th largest company of its type in the giant U.S. electrical industry. The company also supports the Furnas Foundation, a nonprofit organization that has provided over $1 million in funding for higher education and civic projects. The foundation president is Mrs. Joanne Hanson, wife of the company's president and chief executive officer, Richard Hanson. Mr. Hanson is the son of Gilbert and Helen Furnas Hanson and the grandson of the company's founder, William Carlisle Furnas. More about the people who have made Furnas Electric what it is today in a moment. But there are many other notable companies across America that were either founded by or are headed by Furnases. Another is ChemFab of Little Rock, Arkansas. ChemFab is headed by co-owner Lauren Furnas. ChemFab specializes in sheet metal fabrication, processing, and assembly for the aerospace industry, working with alloys of aluminum and titanium and with bonded, composite, or exotic lightweight materials. Employing over 300 workers, it is one of the top 5 employers in that area of the state. Today, Lauren's ChemFab family of companies also includes Master Tool Company for tool making, Airborne Supply for aircraft assembly and bonding, and Aerocell Corporation, an FAA-approved repair station for aircraft structures. Clinical Laboratory of San Bernardino, California, was founded by Raymond Furnas, son of Edgar and Dottie Scoggins Furnas. The company is the largest water bacteria testing company in the U.S., testing for pollutants, minerals, organics, and pesticides. With the retirement of Mr. Furnas, the company is now headed by a new president, and the treasurer administrator is Ray's daughter, Melinda Furnas. Howard Furnas is the son of Howard Earl and Dorothy Collings Furnas. When he retired from government service, he headed for Vermont. After playing in several tennis tournaments there, he founded Unipro Tennis Services, a division of Howard Furnas Associates. As Unipro, he served as a private contractor, developing tennis facilities, designing and staffing courts, and providing consulting services to various tennis clubs and resorts in the eastern part of the country. Remember when we began our story, we said that this is not just Furnas men passing the baton to other Furnas men, that our story was also about Furnas daughters and their sons and daughters? Well, this is one about a Furnas daughter. She comes down from John through Joseph, Benjamin, Samuel, Robert, and her father, James Harold Furnas. She is Marilyn Furnas Schlutz. In 1954, Bob and Marilyn Schlutz began farming and raising and showing purebred Angus cattle. In 1968, they opened their first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise, and today they have 16 restaurants between Iowa and Illinois, plus 3 Casey's General Stores, a motel, and several professional buildings. Oh, they still live on the original farm, but today it is one of 5 farms that they operate, and all of this under the name of Schlutz Enterprises of Columbus Junction, Iowa. Admittedly, these examples overlook the many, many cousins who have achieved great goals in major corporations in the country, but go relatively unrecognized by those of us who admire them so greatly. But in reality, our family, like any family, is made up of individuals. And obviously, we Furnases are generously blessed with great ones. Obviously, there are hundreds of individuals who are deserving of our recognition and admiration, and about whom we know nothing. In the future, we hope to learn of them and add their names to our scrolls. For several years, we have acknowledged as many of these people as we could by preparing bronze plaques in their honor. Here are just a few of them. Therm Smokey Furnas is a highly decorated U.S. Navy hero of World War II who, in separate naval battles, leaped into the water, which was aflame with burning oil, to rescue fellow sailors from sinking U.S. aircraft carriers. Smokey is one of the very few enlisted men mentioned by name in the official U.S. Navy history of World War II. Sarah Furnas Wells, M.D., was a devout Quaker who received her medical degree from Women's Medical College of New York. She studied at the great medical clinics of Europe, then spent 2 years establishing the Women's Medical College of San Francisco. Her most notable writing was her 653-page book detailing her travels throughout the world. After serving a hitch in the Navy as a mechanic, Charles W. Furnas joined Wilbur and Orville Wright as a mechanic and accompanied them to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where on May 14, 1908, he flew with one of the Wright brothers, ascending to about 30 feet on a flight lasting about a minute, but in doing so became the world's first airplane passenger. Daughter of Carrie Furnas and Roy Class, Leona Class Jackson became a U.S. Navy nurse. At the outbreak of World War II, Leona was stationed on Guam and was taken prisoner when the island fell to the Japanese. After repatriation, She received her master's degree at Columbia University and ultimately attained the rank of captain and director of the entire U.S. Navy Nurse Corps. The son of Alan and Maria Furnas Coppock, Douglas Coppock was born in Miami County, Ohio. He was a 75-year Mason and a business leader, founding several companies in the sand and gravel industry. He spent nearly $80,000 for the Annie Oakley Lowell Thomas wing of the Wayne County Historical Society's museum and set aside $500,000 as a gift to the County Memorial Hospital. While there are a number of Furnases who are knowledgeable about the genealogy of the family, it is to a large extent through the labors of Tansy Reeder Furnas that we know so much about our family's past. His 220-page genealogy of the Furnas family is considered to be the foundation upon which most other Furnas family studies are based. Oliver Perry Furnas was born in the old Furnas homestead near Frederick, Ohio, was ordained a minister in 1882, and was beloved pastor for 58 years. A 50-year Mason, Mr. Furnas taught himself Hebrew and later taught it at the college level. Lacking an organist in his congregation, Mr. Furnas also taught himself this skill. As a minister, he received over 2,000 members and officiated at an equal number of funerals, plus some 800 weddings. Daughter of Dr. Earl E. and Madge Furnas, Jane Furnas earned a nursing diploma from the Miami Valley Hospital School of Nursing in Dayton, Ohio, a BS degree from Western Reserve University, and her master's degree from UCLA. She held prominent posts in the Frontier Nursing Service, serving those in the nearly impenetrable mountains of eastern Kentucky with her expertise in midwifery. Jane belonged to many professional nursing organizations and is listed in Who's Who of American Women. Called Poet of the People by admirers, Boyd E. Furnas wrote verses which have found comfortable lodging in the hearts of those for whom he wrote, rather than for the world and for the critics. His book, entitled Poems of Heart and Home, reflects his early life on a farm near Pleasant Hill, Ohio. He was an artist of merit and wrote for many of the foremost papers and magazines of the country. William Carlisle Furnas was born in Edinburgh, Indiana, earned an electrical engineering degree from Purdue University, and went to work for Alice Chalmers. With a head full of ideas, he left there to found the Furnas Electric Company, where he developed many unique electrical motor controls. Under his guidance, Furnas Electric became a highly respected company, noted for its dedication to quality. Richard W. Hansen, son of Gilbert and Helen Furnas Hansen, and grandson of William Carlisle Furnas, also earned his engineering degree from Purdue University. He then served in the Navy before joining Furnas Electric. After many years in various positions, Dick was named president of the company in 1972 and CEO in 1977. Since then, he has guided Furnas Electric to its international prominence. A licensed pilot, Mr. Hansen restores and operates classic aircraft, once piloted his restored Beechcraft to Switzerland and back, and is the proud owner of a beautiful World War II P-40 Warhawk, which he flies for pure enjoyment. His most recent acquisition is co-ownership of a magnificently restored World War II Grumman Wildcat, which was raised from its resting place in 200 feet of water in Lake Michigan, where it had lain for 50 years. Joseph Chamberlain Furnas began writing professionally while still in high school. While at Harvard, he wrote for several leading magazines such as Saturday Evening Post. One of his articles, entitled "And Sudden Death," was reprinted more than any other article in Reader's Digest history. Among the more than a dozen books which J.C. authored were Voyage to Windward, on the life of Robert Louis Stevenson, Goodbye to Uncle Tom, The Road to Harper's Ferry, Devil's Rainbow, about the early Mormons, and Anatomy of Paradise, honored in 1949 for its importance in the field of race relations. Then we come to Isaac Lester Furnas, an Indiana-born dentist. Les Furnas served as a professor of prosthetics and dental technology at what is now Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. As Lieutenant Commander Furnas in the Coast Guard, he went on a 1931 research expedition to the North Pole to study the health habits of Alaskans. During this adventure, he kept a fascinating account documenting the excursion. He later co-authored the American Textbook of Prosthetic Dentistry. In 1922, after breaking many Big Ten records in track and representing Purdue in the 1920 Olympics, Clifford Cook Furnas graduated with a degree in chemical engineering. Upon receiving his PhD from Michigan, he joined the faculty of Yale and later became Chancellor of University of Buffalo. He was subsequently named by President Eisenhower to come to Washington and serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Development. Always a visionary, his extensive writings include such books as America's Tomorrow, The Next 100 Years, and Storehouse of Civilization. A native of Coffeyville, Kansas, Loren L. Furnas served the military in Korea in the 1950s, and through the years he has held several high positions in the Masonic Lodge. Moving his family to Arkansas, he helped build and become co-founder of ChemFab Corporation, which was discussed a few moments ago. Robert W. Furnas, born in Troy, Ohio, the grandson of John and Mary Wilkinson Furnas. By age 23, he was an editor and part owner of the town's newspaper. Becoming restless, he left for the Nebraska Territory. There he organized and commanded 3 regiments of Indians against the Confederates. But when the Indians turned hostile and attacked the Nebraskans, he led a regiment of cavalry against them. Prior to becoming the state's second governor, Robert Furnas sat in the state legislature, published the first agricultural journal, and along with President Cleveland's Secretary of Agriculture, co-founded Arbor Day. He is also responsible for the founding of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Prior to World War II, Wendell J. Furnas taught at the Shanghai American School and was a professor of English at the University of Shanghai. He was captured and held for a time in a Japanese prison until repatriated. Completing the U.S. Navy Japanese language program, he was attached to Admiral Nimitz's Intelligence Center at Pearl Harbor and landed in the first hour of the invasion of Guam. Captain Furnas served in a wide range of highly sensitive intelligence posts, including his last tour as Commandant of the Defense Intelligence School in Washington, D.C. Howard E. Furnas was born in Battle Creek, Michigan, received his A.B. from Hillsdale College, and completed postgraduate work at Harvard before joining the Foreign Service of the U.S. State Department. His career in government spanned 28 years. His dozen or so assignments included time with the U.S. Embassy in India and as Special Assistant for Intelligence to the Secretary of State in our mission to NATO in Paris. He was also a professor of international relations and a trustee at Windham College in Vermont. Earl E. Furnas was the oldest offspring of Oliver Perry and Harriet Evans Furnas. He was born in Miami County, Ohio in 1880 and entered Sterling Medical School, now part of the Ohio State University, in 1905. Early in his practice, he was the sole physician for decades in Englewood, Ohio. First Lieutenant Furnas was an Army physician at Camp Sherman, where he tended to doughboys during the Great Flu epidemic of World War I. Doc Furnas was a true old-fashioned country doctor who provided home health care long before it became fashionable or profitable. Adam J. Furnas was born in Ohio but spent the greater part of his life in Columbus City, Iowa. In September of 1861, he joined the 44th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and spent 4 long years fighting in many of the major battles of the Civil War. During his service, Furnas kept a detailed account of his experiences in a diary entitled 44 Months at the Front. Even wounded, he kept up his writing, which brings the excitement and the tedium of war to life, the sickness and cold and wetness which, he said, took its toll, with nearly as many dead from illness that year as from the first major encounter. Dr. David W. Furnas is chief Division of Plastic Surgery at University of California, Irvine, an unusually comprehensive 48-line biography in Who's Who in America gives a biographical cross-section of his professional life. A sampling of his achievements includes Diplomate, American Board of Plastic Surgery, Assistant Resident in Plastic Surgery at Cornell Medical Center, Registrar, Royal Infirmary and Affiliated Hospitals, Glasgow, Scotland, Surgeon in the East Africa Flying Doctors Service, author-editor of 5 textbooks, and expedition leader of Explorers Club Skull Surgeons of the Kisii tribe of Nairobi. The Reverend John Doane Furnas was born in Indiana to William E. and Emma Doane Furnas. In Virginia, he became a member of Lincoln Monthly Meeting until released to the Presbyterian Church in 1933. A graduate of Earlham College, he received Bachelor of Divinity, Master of Arts, and Doctor of Divinity degrees from San Francisco Theological Seminary. Ordained in 1935, Dr. Furnas taught Bible and Greek at the college level and later was called to the pastorate of First Presbyterian Church in Moscow, Idaho. There followed a number of important positions, including Field Director of Christian Education for the state of Oregon, Synod Executive for Oregon, and Professor of Field Education at his alma mater. With his life's companion, Esther Bradbury Hare, the couple brought to us one of the most distinguished families ever to grace our rolls. They had 4 children: David W. Furnas, M.D., Chief of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, University of California, Irvine; E. Joan Furnas Corstania, M.D., Radiologist, Davis, California; Paul L. Furnas of Davis, California, Ph.D. in Renaissance music; and Margaret Ann Furnas DeVude, volunteer in schools, Boise, Idaho. It's impossible when one deals with names, dates, and events to be totally complete and accurate. We are quick to acknowledge that we have no doubt overlooked many highly deserving cousins in putting this story together. It is interesting to note that, as Eli J. wrote in his booklet, The Furnas Family in America, John and Mary Furnas both died rather young, but their children all lived to a fair age. Joseph died in his 50th year, considered to be years past the average in those days. William passed away in his 59th year, but John died a few days after his 65th birthday. Esther lacked but a few days of reaching 65. Rebecca and Thomas both died in their 79th year, and Robert in his 91st. Someday, this presentation may well be updated to achieve this very goal. But as we all realize, the fabric of the family's history continues to be woven into an ever-growing tapestry. We Furnases have indeed traveled a long road since John and Mary left England and made that awesome and terrifying voyage to America aboard a tiny sailing vessel. John with the heavy burden of responsibility for his wife and his young brothers, but especially Mary in the last trimester of her pregnancy, painful week after dreadful week on a turbulent and unforgiving ocean, headed for some strange far-off land of perils and promise. And as a final observation, we quote from the last few paragraphs of the little booklet by Eli J. The descendants of John and Mary Wilkinson Furnas have been persons of good ability, self-reliant, and mindful of others' interests as well as their own. They have generally proved themselves equal to the demands of the situation which they have been called upon to act. Their living descendants have good reasons for being proud of their ancestry and for regarding with commendable approval the praise that has been accomplished by various members of the family in the past and in the present generations. To this, we may merely add that future generations of Furnases will, in their own way and in their own times, be equally deserving of our admiration, our pride, and our gratitude. Thank you for sharing this time with all of us in the Furnas family, in America and everywhere.